Okay, so today I want to kind of go over this third discussion and what I was looking for in it because many of you don't seem to be getting the ideas here, right? All right, so the third discussion is about economic changes in wealth. What is wealth? How is the idea of wealth changing in the period from 1450 to 1750 throughout the world? How does it impact the common man? Does it does it affect the common man? Does wealth trickle down? How is it related to technological advancements? How does it relate to the Columbian Exchange? Which societies benefit from the new wealth and which suffer? Is this new distribution of wealth and power the basis for racism and slavery? Why or why not? Okay, I'm going to try to take each one of those questions apart for you with reference to our sources, right? Now, I'm finding that many of you are not using all of the required sources, and I have them listed here in each discussion on each content page. If you're using Bentley, it should be chapters 25 and 26 and 27. If you're using Strayer and Nelson, it should be chapter 14. If you're using von Sivers, it should be chapter 18, chapter 19, and chapter 20. If you're using Cordas, it should be chapter 3, early modern Africa and the wider world. And you should be using Frankopan chapter 13 and Harari chapter 14, both of which were attached, right? All right, so the very first question up here, what is wealth? Now, here's a secret, and I think I've shared this with you, but if not, here it is very clearly. If I put quotes around something, in this case, the single quote, what is wealth, setting it aside as what is its definition, that means I expect you to define it, right? You need to let me know what you think it is. So that's going to apply to wealth itself, to this idea of who the common man is, what trickle down means, what new wealth means. All of those are things that you needed to define in the course of answering the question because I don't necessarily have the same idea about these things that you do, right? All right. So many of you gave me a definition of wealth, but you didn't cite it. Where did you go get that definition of wealth? Is it your own idea of what wealth is, or did you pick it up from one of the textbooks? Did you pick it up from Harari or Frankopan, or did you go look it up in an encyclopedia? Excuse me, an encyclopedia or a dictionary? Whatever the case, you needed to cite that. For the most part, wealth is an abundance of resource over and above what you need to survive, right? So, how's the idea of wealth changing in the period from 1450 to 1750 throughout the world? Not just limited to one place, but throughout the world. The biggest and most broad answer, of course, is that what had once been situational, because most places were pretty insular, wealth was based in agriculture, in what an area could produce, and that wealth moved up the chain with the peasants producing it, producing agricultural product, and having to give some percentage of that agricultural product to their local lord, who in turn had to give some to the lord above him, who in turn had to give some to the lord above him, all the way up the chain to where you get the very elite people at the very top, your kings, your emperors, etc., who had the most wealth because they had the most disposable income that they could do anything with that they wanted, right? But now, in this new age of globalization, because it is, now that we've brought the Western Hemisphere into the trading center, wealth is expanding. And it's expanding because many European places, particularly Spain and Portugal, but eventually also including the Dutch, the French, the British, are going to be controlling and taking wealth from the Western Hemisphere and from Africa and from Southeast Asia, right? If you were using Cordas and Bentley, actually, if you're using any of these, a lot of what you are going to see is how Africa is changing. And a lot of that is because of the Portuguese setting up their trading post empire basically around Africa. They are taking from Africa gold, uh, jewels, people, in the form of slaves. That's a big chunk of it and grows into an even bigger chunk of it. But also things like elephant tusk, ivory, and other commodities that they can trade in other parts of the world, right? Your textbook focuses a lot on Africa and also on other parts of the Western Hemisphere and Southeast Asia. And these were things that you should have been looking at. How are these areas being impacted by this, right? It's changing because trade is becoming very dominant. So we're going to be getting more of what is called specialization. Areas that produce certain things are going to be exporting those things, or those things are going to be taken from them uh, in exchange for other things that they don't have. So places are becoming more specialized and being encouraged to produce more of one particular thing or two or three particular things that can be traded on a global scale instead of just in the local way. All right, so how does it impact the common man? And does it affect the common man? Well, this is a complex answer. Who is still the common man? Well, the common man almost everywhere in the world is still basically your agricultural worker, because even though we now have a lot more merchants and a lot more trading going on, the common man is still the person producing these items that are being traded, and the common man is the one being forced to specialize in the production of these particular items, right? Does it affect him? Yes, in the sense that he's going to be forced to become more dependent on trading specific things in order to buy the food that he needs to eat. The amount of land he can use now for production of food for himself and his family is going to become smaller because more and more pressure is going to be applied to him by the merchants and by his government and the people directly above him to produce the things that they can make money on. So it definitely affects him that way. Does it mean he has more recourse to resource? It depends. Maybe, maybe not. In many places, no. If you were a Native American, if you were an African slave, if you were enslaved in other parts of the world, if you were a peasant in some other parts of the world, you didn't have resource to these commodities because these commodities that are being traded are being brought to large urban areas. Many of you talked about Frankopan's reference to urban areas and their advantages, but again, this is only for the people in them. This isn't for the people living further out in the rural countryside who aren't going to be able to get these things. This also goes to the idea of trickling down. Now, what is trickle down? Trickle down is the idea that if people at the top are making money, they're going to send it downward. But is this the case? Do they do that? Not in most societies. They usually keep it within themselves. They don't tend to expand it downward. The price of goods overall might go down in some areas. We could consider that to be a function of trickle down, but overall, not so much. How is it related to technological advancements? Well, most of you went to the discussions from both Harari and Frankopan, which is good, about the advances in shipbuilding. But Harari talks a lot about the scientific method and how it benefits humankind overall. That question was actually kind of set up so that you could go to Harari for that. How does it relate to the Columbian Exchange? Harari and Frankopan both talk about that. Frankopan doing a lot more with it. On the broader sense of it, in about 200 years after when the Columbian Exchange starts in the early 1500s, it's going to increase food distribution because many of the products that were grown in the Western Hemisphere that are sent back to Eurasia, many of them will be very adaptable there. Probably one of the best examples, are potatoes. Potatoes were originally developed in South America. They were part of the Incan culture, but the way that they were consumed, the product that was consumed there was actually one that had to be buried in the ground for about a year so that the poison in the naturally occurring thing that we refer to as a potato in South America was very poisonous. So they buried it in the ground so that so the ground could leach the poison out of it. So it took about 2 years from the time it was grown until the poison had been leached out of it for it to be consumable by the average person. Once, however, it was taken to Eurasia, it was hybridized to the point that it became the basis of the economy and the diet of the people living in Ireland. And in fact, today we still talk about Irish potatoes or white potatoes. Those were created there. The Idaho potato was a variation of that as well. So it would become the basis literally of the poor population of Ireland for 200 to 300 years. And in fact, as we'll see when we get to the 1800s, many of you jumped ahead, probably because of Harari and his discussion of industrialization, to the industrial age. Many of the people who would become the workers of the new industry um, in the Industrial Revolution would be the Irish who come to Britain, to England specifically, and to the United States because of the potato blight, the disease that begins to eradicate potatoes in Ireland, leading to extensive poverty and death, literally from people starving to death. So these technological advances uh, that are related to the Columbia Exchange definitely have to do with ships, but also with new agricultural techniques, new ways of moving goods around and hybridizing them so that they can be grown in other places. Which societies benefit from the new wealth and which suffer? Okay, benefit European, definitely. That's a big part of what Frankopan's talking about in his discussion of the road to Northern Europe. Um, who suffers? Well, again, indigenous peoples in the Western Hemisphere, indigenous peoples in Africa, indigenous peoples in Southeast Asia, in poor people in some of these other areas, again, who are being forced to specialize in what they produce and not being allowed to grow as much food for themselves. Is it the basis for racism and slavery? Of course. There's no way around that. And the why, of course, is because of the developing idea that's also a byproduct of the scientific revolution, that the color of your skin has something to do with your ability to learn and your ability to be productive. This again is going to definitely come out of the Enlightenment. Harari talks about Newton and the movement of science, the new science, the ability to recognize our own ignorance as a people, and to question things. Um, but this also will eventually lead to this idea of the creation of racism, that there is a scientific reason, in theory, for why some people should be slaves and some should not. Right? All right, so that's the big thing. I want to point out again, though, that you're supposed to be having the multimedia things in here, and you need to be having that section in your discussions where you talk about the comparison of your sources. As an example, I'm not going to bring a multimedia into it because you can pick that on your own, but comparing Harari and Frankopan, Harari's chapter is definitely a discussion of the scientific revolution, whereas Frankopan's chapter is a discussion of the economics that come out of the Columbian Exchange, right? Again, those questions were in there specifically. You could have done very well noting at that point in time that their perspectives on this time period are similar in that they're both looking at why Europe comes ahead, or at least begins to compete with these other big empires that have existed. But their mechanisms for it are different. Frankopan's definitely talking about the economics of the Columbian Exchange and how Europeans, starting with the Spanish and the Portuguese, are extracting wealth, but also these other side effects, right? Harari's talking about the scientific revolution specifically, the rise of mathematics, and he gives that really good example of the development of statistics as a function for predicting how something's going to play out. In this case, that insurance pool of Presbyterian ministers. That's a really interesting, fun little story in there. Your textbook, and it doesn't really matter which textbook you've chosen, even though there is nuance in which one you've chosen, but for the most part, the textbooks are talking principally about the impacts of these things on African societies, the Western Hemisphere, and Southeast Asia, right? So their perspective has a lot to do with how those areas are suffering from the Columbian Exchange and from these new definitions of wealth, because they're the ones who are suddenly going to be put hierarchically at the bottom of the social structure, no matter where they are. All right, so that's basically a wrap up of the economic changes. You want to be thinking about that in week 4 up here, and I've noticed that I didn't have a lot of responses in week 4. I want to go up and talk about, sorry, to the top here, the discussion for week 4, because again, there's that nuance that you need to be looking for, the cultural transformations, right? For this week, you're still looking at Frankopan chapter 13, but you're also looking at Harari chapter 15. And it's a really fun chapter also, because in some ways he's going to go towards talking about what Frankopan was talking about last week. For your textbook, though, you're going to be looking at transformations and cultural transformations, particularly in Europe. If you're looking at Harari, chapter 15, sorry, it is the marriage of science and empire. He's directly going to bring into um, the discussion how the new science is being financed politically and why. And this is a really big point of these cultural transformations that we're talking about here this week. So you want to be thinking about that, and again, including that paragraph. If you didn't do it in your top post, think about in response to me, because I am going to be asking you those questions. How do they compare in terms of their perspective? Think about that also. All right, if you have questions about the discussion for chapter 3 or about how to be doing these discussions, please let me know. Please bear in mind that your peer comments need to be substantive. They need to have information in them. In fact, they are the opportunity for you to expand on what you put in the top post and to bring in different things from what you had in your top post, and to help complement and flesh out the discussion points. You need those 3 peer comments. You need 3 of them between the day you post your top post on Thursday and Monday, right? So be sure you start getting those in there and make them substantive, because if they're not substantive, there's just going to be a 0. You're not really doing anything if you're just making general broad comments without any citation. And that's another thing. If your peer comments don't have citation, then you either are missing citation, which means your citation grade is going to be low, or you're not actually putting enough information in there to warrant them being substantive. A substantive peer comment needs citation. It needs reference to one of the sources and development of an idea in that source. All right, again, if you have questions, email me. I look forward to seeing our cultural transformations expansion. Thank you.